Hello. So in this video, we're going to be talking about the Narrative of Louis Asa-Asa, A Captured African, which was printed as an appendix to Mary Prince's The History of Mary Prince. So Asa-Asa's story is an interesting supplement to Mary Prince's story because she was born in Bermuda. And so she was not taken from Africa into slavery. She was born into slavery in the West Indies, whereas Louis Asa-Asa was born in West Africa and was captured into slavery. So basically a short version of his narrative, which is quite a short narrative anyway. He was living in a reasonably large-sized town in West Africa. He compares it to the English city of Brighton, which I don't have a good sense necessarily of how big Brighton was in the late 18th century, early 19th century, but Mary Prince's narrative was published in 1831, so however big Brighton was shortly before that. Regardless, it was a reasonably good-sized city. Basically, slave raiders come and burn down a lot of the stuff in this city. They kill a lot of people. They capture a lot of people, including Louis. He's taken to the coast. He's sold around between different slave traders before finally being sold to the French. The French slave ship has horrific conditions, which was standard for slave trading, the triangle trade. The conditions were horrendous across the board, regardless of what nationality the slave traders were. And then when this French ship is driven by the winds to England, Louis and the small number of slaves that are still on board are freed under English law. So, it's an interesting narrative because it tells us a lot of stuff. It tells us a lot of stuff that Mary Prince's narrative doesn't tell us. And it's much more concise than something like the interesting narrative of the life of Olayuta Equiano, who has similar experiences of being captured in West Africa by slave raiders and then sold at the coast to Europeans, put on ships, etc., etc. Louis Asa-Asa's story is a little less than 3 pages in this size text, so it's very, very concise. But there's parts of it that are very interesting. So I want to read you this section about the slave raids, because I think this is a very striking thing. And I do want to preface this by saying white supremacist fucks often try to make much of the fact that a lot of African slave trading was done by Africans themselves, and historically that is true. It is worth noting that a big portion of what drove the demand for slaves in West Africa was the desire of Europeans to have a cheap labor force in the New World. And certainly the role of Africans in the slave trade is not negligible, but it's sort of like blaming the U.S. appetite for drugs on South Americans being willing to supply those drugs, right? They would not supply them if there wasn't a demand for them. So I think that's a thing that's worth noting. I mean, the fact that Africans engaged in slavery and slave trading does not let the U.S. or white Europeans, people of European descent, etc., off the hook for our own horrific evil. But this is how Asa-Asa describes the slave raids. A great many people, whom we called Adinyes, set fire to Egi, which is the name of his town, in the morning before daybreak. There were some thousands of them. They killed a great many and burnt all their houses. They stayed 2 days and then carried away all the people whom they did not kill. They came again every now and then for a month, as long as they could find people to carry away. They used to tie them by the feet, except when they were taking them off, and then they let them loose. But if they offered to run away, they would shoot them. I lost a great many friends and relatives at Egi, about a dozen. They sold all they carried away to be slaves. I know this because I afterwards saw them as slaves on the other side of the sea. They took away brothers and sisters and husbands and wives. They did not care about this. They were sold for cloth or gunpowder, sometimes for salt or guns. Sometimes they got 4 or 5 guns for a man. They were English guns, made like a master's, that I cleaned for his shooting. The Adinyes burned a great many places besides Egi. They burned all the country wherever they found villages. They used to shoot men, women, and children if they ran away. They came to us about 11 o'clock one day, and directly they came, they set our house on fire. All of us had run away. We kept together and went into the woods and stopped there 2 days. The Adinyes then went away, and we returned home and found everything burnt. We tried to build a little shed and were beginning to get comfortable again. We found several of our neighbors lying about wounded. They had been shot. I saw the bodies of 4 or 5 little children whom they had killed with blows on the head. They had carried away their fathers and mothers, but the children were too small for slaves, so they killed them. They had killed several others, but these were all I saw. I saw them lying in the street like dead dogs. So, you've got that initial horrendous traumatic experience, but then Asa-Asa is captured by the Adinyes, and he's carried to the coast, and again, he gets sold between different groups, different people, whatever it is, before finally being sold to the French. And what he says here about the French should undercut any notion you have that white people in the slave trade were kinder or more compassionate than Africans. So he says here, we were taken in a boat from place to place and sold at every place we stopped at. In about 6 months, we got to a ship in which we first saw white people. They were French. They bought us. We found here a great many other slaves. There were about 80, including women and children. The Frenchmen sent away all but 5 of us into another very large ship. We 5 stayed on board till we got to England, which was about 5 or 6 months. The slaves we saw on board the ship were chained together by the legs below deck, so close they could not move. They were flogged very cruelly. I saw one of them flogged till he died. We could not tell what for. They gave them enough to eat. The place they were confined in below deck was so hot and nasty I could not bear to be in it. A great many of the slaves were ill, but they were not attended to. They used to flog me very bad on board the ship. The captain cut my head very bad one time. So again, this kind of brutality, this kind of cramming as many human beings as possible into the hold of a ship in order to maximize the amount of cargo that you could transport. These are standard elements of the slave trade. And they were big targets in the British anti-slave trade movement, which really picked up a lot of steam in the latter half of the 1700s. So by the time that Mary Prince and Louis Asa-Asa are around, really the slave trade... So Mary Prince was born in 1788, which predates the abolition of the slave trade in Britain. We don't really know when Louis Asa-Asa was born, but his narrative is being published at the same time, so probably in the late 1700s to early 1800s. So he probably was quite young when the slave trade was formally abolished in Britain, which was 1807 with the Slave Trade Act of 1807, but slavery continued. Until the Slavery Abolition Act 1833, which gradually abolished slavery within the British Empire. It was not a sort of immediate, everyone is freed, yay kind of moment. It was very much a staged manumission, right? It was a movement toward gradually liberating all of the slaves within the British Empire. And so that included large numbers of slaves in the Caribbean, for instance, places like Bermuda, places like Jamaica, Barbados, these English colonies that produced a lot of wealth for the British Empire through the use of slave labor. Mary Prince, if she had survived long enough, and I think she died in 1833, so she died the same year that the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 came out. But if she had lived long enough, she would have been freed under that act, probably. But in 1831, when this book is published, slavery was still legal. And so that's an interesting element here because one of the rhetorical moves you frequently see in British slave narratives, and I include Mary Prince, I include Louis Asa-Asa, I include Olayuta Equiano, even though none of these people were born in Britain and none of them were ethnically English, Welsh, Scottish, Irish, whatever it is. They were British subjects or lived in Britain at one point or another. There is this standard rhetorical move of sort of hoping for the king who presides over this slave empire to free the slaves. And I get why that rhetorical move is made. These are narratives written for a British public that is typically very patriotic, that typically believes in the ethics, the goodness of the British people and the British monarchy, etc., etc. But it's also just strangely naive from the perspective, at the very least, of 2025, where we are probably much more cynical about those in political power than people might have been in the early 19th century. But the last paragraph of Asa-Asa's narrative, this is what it says. I'm very happy to be in England. As far as I am, very well, but I have no friend belonging to me but God, who will take care of me as he has done already. Come back to that. I should like much to see my friends again, but I do not now wish to go back to them, for if I go back to my own country, I might be taken as a slave again. I would rather stay here where I am free than go back to my country to be sold. I shall stay in England as long as, please God, I shall live. I wish the King of England could know all I have told you. I wish it that he may see how cruelly we are used. We had no king in our country, or he would have stopped it. I think the King of England might stop it, and this is why I wish him to know it all. I have heard say he is good, and if he is, he will stop it if he can. I am well off myself, for I am well taken care of, and have good bed and good clothes, but I wish my own people to be as comfortable. So this would be King William IV in 1831. My sense is that William IV was a somewhat reform-minded king. I don't know a massive amount about him necessarily. He did sign the Slave Act of 1833, so cool, props for that. Bare minimum, I guess you could do to be a decent human being. But it is very interesting that there's this sort of, I'm grateful to God who allowed me to be enslaved and go through these horrific experiences, if a God exists. And I'm grateful to the king. I'm hopeful that the king will help abolish slavery despite ruling over a slave empire and profiting immensely from the practice of slavery. It is very striking. The other thing that I want to mention about this, Mary Prince's narrative is part of the broader British anti-slavery movement. Louis Asa-Asa's narrative is part of the broader British anti-slavery movement, and it is prefaced, I think, with an introduction by Thomas Pringle, who edited and published Mary Prince's narrative. And one of the things he says here in this introduction is that other servants have seen Asa sort of mumbling to himself and asked what he meant. And he said, "Methink what a good thing I come to England. Here I know what God is and read my Bible. In my country they have no God, no Bible." That's not strictly speaking true. West Africa has a wide range of religions. So some of the religions do not have sort of set holy texts, but Islam and Christianity are also both prevalent in West Africa, and they were at the time as well. But then Pringle goes on. "How severe and just a reproof to the guilty wretches who visit his country only with fire and sword. How deserved a censure upon the not less guilty men who dare to vindicate the state of slavery on the lying pretext that its victims are of an inferior nature, and scarcely less deserving of reprobation are those who have it in their power to prevent these crimes, but who remain inactive from indifference or are dissuaded from throwing the shield of British power over the victim of oppression by the sophistry and the clamor and the avarice of the oppressor. It is a reproach and the sin of England. May God avert from our country the ruin which this national guilt deserves." So what I find very striking there is that the British abolitionist cause, which very rightly opposed the continuation of slavery, does not seem to come with the corollary of believing that African cultures or religions are good and worthwhile in themselves. So, it's 1831. You get what you get in 1831. But, yeah, that's not ideal.